So, one of the biggest anime events in years is right around the corner, as Solo Leveling, the manhwa that swept the world about 5 or so years ago, is finally getting its anime adaptation, and by A1 Pictures no less, one of the premier animation studios out of Japan. And since it's going to be running up against relatively slim competition in what is a relatively weak winter 2024 seasonal anime slate, Solo Leveling is going to be the only thing that people are talking about for at least the next 12 weeks. I actually don't know if they're planning on doing 12 or 24 episodes. They definitely have enough manhwa for 24. But how do I know it's going to be the only thing people are talking about until April? Well, because it's already the only thing people are talking about, and it's not out yet. See, for those of you who have been living under a rock for the last, I don't know, 2 to 3 months, you wouldn't have known that on January 6th, we're getting the first episode of Solo Leveling. And if for some reason you didn't know that, go ahead and watch the 4 trailers they've already released. It looks like it's going to be incredible. But where is all of this hype coming from? For those of you who don't read manhwa or web novels or really even manga, the idea of a South Korean story being the biggest anime in years might be a bit perplexing. And honestly, I wouldn't be able to blame you. I can hardly keep up with all of the Japanese releases, let alone Korean. Oh, very obviously, this is in English. So where's this hype coming from? Are the novels even good? Is the manhwa worth reading? Do I have to go to webnovel.com to finish the story? Or is the only other competition anime-wise coming out in winter 2024 Assassination Classroom Season 3 and Mashal Season 2? Oh, and Delicious in Dungeon. How could I forget? Real, no hate to Assassination Classroom. I've seen the first 2 seasons, but this is the weakest season of anime I can remember in a couple of years. Maybe more importantly than is the story good, because a lot of you are going to make your own decisions on that. Who are the main characters of this story? How do their abilities work? And how does the world around them operate? Well, we're going to be answering all those questions and a lot more today, guys, because today we're talking everything you need to know before Solo Leveling's anime comes out. Before we get into giving you the rundown on all things jinwoo, I'm going to need you to please, for me, go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you like the idea of me talking about Solo Leveling, you're gonna love my anime podcast because it's gonna be the keynote of our next 12 episodes. So if you want to hear me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week, then go ahead and give us a follow. We're available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Should I have mentioned that it was Otaku's Anonymous? Probably. And something else that I should mention as it pertains to Otaku's Anonymous is my merch store, otakusanonymous.net. That is some of the greatest anime t-shirts, sweatshirts, and sticker packs known to man. Really mixing up the plugs today. I'm feeling light on my toes. And maybe it's the release of Solo Leveling that's doing that to me. So everybody, I hope you brought your books because today we're doing Solo Leveling 101. Though, that being said, if you've read this novel, then you actually probably don't need this video, but it's a good refresher. So let's open with the basics here. Solo Leveling is a manhwa, not a manga, meaning it comes from South Korea, not Japan. However, before it was a manhwa, like plenty of manga, it was a web novel, which mind you is completed. The web novel has 13 volumes on webnovel.com. Now, once the web novel got a lot of attention in South Korea, it got a manhwa, which is also completed. And the manhwa is 179 chapters long. It's important to note, however, that the manhwa is not a one-to-one adaptation of the web novel. Just like with One Punch Man, there are some key differences between the manhwa and the web novel. Not like so massive that it's an entirely different story, but there are definitely some rather key differences. But sitting at a roughly 179 chapters, Solo Leveling as an entire story is about half as long as MHA currently is. And while it was both incredibly popular as a web novel and a manhwa, genuinely, the hype train around Solo Leveling didn't start choo-chooing out of the station until the English and Japanese adaptations were made into these physical copies. See, as it currently stands, there are 7 of these volumes that are about 300 pages of the most beautiful artwork you've ever seen in your entire life. And it stands to reason, because there's 13 volumes of the web novel, that there will be 13 volumes of the physical copies. And considering the fact that the 7th volume just released in August of 2023, we are now over halfway through the adaptation of Solo Leveling's entire story. But that doesn't mean if you don't speak Korean, you can't finish the story today, because you absolutely can. Both the web novel and the manhwa have been translated to English. However, not officially. See, let's say you watch episode 1 of Solo Leveling and you're so entranced by its story that you feel the need to finish it right now. The best way to go about that would be to go to webnovel.com and look up not Solo Leveling, but a little ditty by the name of I Alone Level Up. Yes, that's right, Solo Leveling is actually not a direct translation of the Korean name. So under fan translations, it's not called Solo Leveling, it's called I Alone Level Up. And the consensus on webnovel.com is that the best fan translator is a person by the name of 25th_chestnut. So if you're looking to finish the Solo Leveling story right now, you can, but it won't be an official release or an official translation. But if I could give you a piece of advice, I'd recommend waiting for the rest of these copies to come out because, like I said, the artwork is stunningly gorgeous, and if you get them online, they're like $8 a piece and they're 300 pages. But enough about outside of the universe things, let's talk about in-universe things that you need to know about solo leveling. And once again, let's start with the basics here. So let's go as wide view as possible and talk about the world in which solo leveling happens. The world of solo leveling is a modern fantasy story, and while I make the joke quite often that it's basically an isekai, it isn't really. See, it's a modern fantasy anime in the way that stories like Noragami are modern fantasy anime. That is to say that the world of solo leveling is exactly like ours, except for one key difference. And that one key difference is the existence of things known as dungeons. See, dungeons are a phenomenon in solo leveling that exist all across the world. However, they didn't always exist. See, dungeons began appearing in the world 1 or 2 generations back in the solo leveling world, and thus are a relatively new problem. But these dungeons are exactly what you think they are. Any logic or rules that you have revolving around the world dungeon applies to these dungeons. Any content that you consumed that has dungeons, like is it wrong to try and pick up girls in a dungeon or World of Warcraft, has pretty much the exact same dungeons as solo leveling. But to be a bit more specific, the dungeons in solo leveling are actually gates that connect 2 separate worlds. And those 2 separate worlds are the human world and the chaos world. And as you can guess, the chaos world is filled with monsters. Thus, when these dungeons appear in different places all across the world, a tunnel is drawn between the human world and the chaos world. And thus, every single one of these dungeons has the possibility of releasing the monsters in said dungeon into the human world, which you could imagine would be a pretty big issue. But does that happen immediately? Is there a certain set of circumstances that have to happen for those monsters to leave the dungeon and enter the human world? And how do we avoid those circumstances? Well, fortunately, it's just a timer. From the second a dungeon appears, humanity has 7 days to close that dungeon. And if within those 7 days that dungeon isn't closed, that dungeon will undergo something known as collapse, where the dungeon itself will collapse and all of the monsters that were within it will be able to enter the human world. And that kind of thing just can't happen, because if it's a high-ranking dungeon, then the level of monsters that will enter the human world could possibly end the world. And thus hunters are sent to these dungeons to close them before those 7 days are up. But how does one close a gate? Well, in order to close a dungeon, a group of hunters have to enter the dungeon and kill a bunch of monsters until eventually they find the boss room. At which point they have to enter the boss room, kill the boss, and after the boss is dead, they have 10 hours until the dungeon will close itself, essentially destroying the tunnel between the chaos worlds and the human world. So, like I said earlier, any logic and knowledge that you have about dungeons applies to the dungeons in solo leveling. Beat the dungeon, you gotta kill the boss. It's the way it works, with the only exception being that after the boss is killed, you only have 10 hours to escape the dungeon, which I know sounds like plenty of time, because usually when you do a dungeon in a video game, if you beat the boss, there's a portal sending you back to the top at the back of the boss's room. That's not the case in solo leveling, and the dungeons can be absolutely massive. And thus, let's say if hypothetically it takes you 10 hours to get to the boss's room, you're gonna have to sprint back after killing it. But hunters don't just do things willy-nilly. See, while hunters are individuals, they all belong to something known as the Hunters Association, which is one of the biggest, most profitable, most powerful companies on Earth, and anything pertaining to dungeons and hunters is run through them, down to which hunters are assigned to take out which dungeon. See, each dungeon is given a grade, from E to S. Depending on the grade of the dungeon, that determines how many hunters and of what level need to be sent in to close it, which is where the hunters in their rank system comes into play, because hunters, just like dungeons, are also ranked from E to S. Well, at least for the majority of the story. There actually is a rank above S, and that's known as National, which is the rank that belongs to the strongest hunters of each country. But how does a hunter get their rank, and are they able to change it? Well, every single hunter is a human who has superpowers. However, some of their superpowers aren't so super. See, because when dungeons appeared on Earth a couple decades prior to our story, humans also began to awaken powers. But just because you awaken powers does not mean you're a hunter, as there is actually a couple of characters within the story that are humans with powers who never got their hunter license. And that's what separates a human with powers from a hunter. Because in order to become a hunter, you have to A, have undergone an awakening that gave you powers, and B, go to the Hunter Association to get a hunter's license. And this is done in order to regulate who enters what dungeons and to make it as safe as possible, to minimize human casualty. And therefore, if you undergo an awakening that gives you powers, you can go to the Hunters Association and get your license. And at that point, you can start entering dungeons, only at the discretion of the Hunters Association. Now, technically, the problem with that system is that weak hunters are always going to end up in weak dungeons. And just like with all dungeons, throughout all pieces of media, the weaker the dungeon, the worse the loot. See, if one is to go into an S rank dungeon, they'll be able to make a fortune off the loot. However, the loot given by something like a D rank dungeon is barely enough to live on, especially when we consider the fact that one of the key rules of the Hunter Association is that you always have to enter with a group of hunters. In fact, the least amount of hunters required to enter a dungeon is 8. That means if you're not able to cobble together at least 8 hunters, you shouldn't be able to enter and close a dungeon, which is kind of where the obvious dynamic of solo leveling comes from, because Jinwoo, our main character, wants to go into dungeons and beat them by himself. So, however, because of the Hunter Association, he can't really do that. It also works this way because not all hunters have the same abilities. See, hunters can fall into a myriad of different categories, but the two biggest categories are combatants and non-combatants. Now, non-combatants usually refers to healers, as there are important characters throughout the entire story that have the ability to heal other hunters, but not really the ability to fight for themselves. In fact, one of the most important characters in the early part of the story, Juhi, is a B rank healer. However, there's a lot of additional classifications within the catch-all of combatants, as combatants can be fighters, mages, assassins, tankers, or rangers. And while technically there's more classifications under those individual classifications, as mages can be things like fire mages or necromancers. Usually the Hunter Association will send in an even balance of all of these categorizations to make sure that a group has the best possible chance of being able to close a dungeon. And therefore, since even the strongest hunters can really only check so many boxes, a group dynamic is usually considered to be the best. But since Jinwoo starts off the story as the weakest hunter in all of South Korea, he's usually stuck doing E or D rank dungeons. And he shouldn't go any higher than that, because it's not like he got this title for wearing a stupid shirt on his first day of work. Jinwoo does start the story as inarguably the weakest person in all of South Korea, at least the weakest hunter. In fact, he's so weak that his presence in a dungeon raiding party is actually usually viewed as good luck, as any dungeon raid that the Hunter Association decides he can be a part of is guaranteed to be relatively safe. And in the business of fighting monsters, safe is usually best, as being a hunter is incredibly dangerous. And even in these incredibly weak dungeons, Jinwoo is constantly in the need of being healed or the need to be hospitalized after the dungeon is completed. As one of the first things that we learn about Jinwoo in the story is that he was hospitalized after a D rank dungeon, which is pretty much considered to be the weakest dungeon that one can enter, because while E rank dungeons do technically exist, the lowest we've ever seen in the story is D. By the way, it feels important to note that the second that a dungeon opens, the Hunter Association is able to tell how powerful that dungeon is. Unless, of course, it's something like a double dungeon, or a dungeonception as I call it, where there'll be a dungeon, but that dungeon doesn't have a boss room, and thus you have to traverse further into that first dungeon, technically to a second dungeon that will have a boss room. However, because that is a unique second dungeon, there's really no way for the Hunter Association to assess that that second dungeon might be more powerful. And thus, in the case of double dungeons, you're actually kind of walking blind into the second dungeon. Now, naturally, Jinwoo, as the weakest hunter in all of South Korea, holds the lowest rank, E. However, even though Jinwoo is an E-ranked hunter who's in perpetual danger in every single dungeon he enters, he became a hunter in order to pay for his mother's hospital bills and his sister's education. So, good guy. However, Jinwoo doesn't stay the weakest for long. Wouldn't really be an interesting story if he did. Because in the first volume, and I assume it will either be the first or the second episode of the anime, Jinwoo undergoes something known as a second awakening that gives him and only him access to what can only really be called an RPG-like leveling system, one where the more monsters he fights and the more dungeons he closes, he gets experience. And thus, by completing quests, daily quests, and avoiding penalties, he's able to use the experience he's gaining to make himself more powerful by stacking points into things like speed, durability, strength, that all have real-life repercussions to his actual body. If he puts points in speed, he gets faster. If he puts points in strength, he gets bigger and taller, and so on and so forth. This RPG-like leveling system allows him to truly have no ceiling. And the reason it's called a second awakening is because any human with powers on Earth currently had to undergo an awakening to magic, an awakening to their abilities. And technically, the moment you awaken to power is the exact moment how powerful you will be is decided. Let's say hypothetically, while sitting here right now, I awoke powers. If I awoke what the Hunter Association would refer to as C-rank powers, that's who I am. I'm a C-rank hunter. While I could get stronger faster by training my physical body, the magic I have access to would never get stronger. And thus, when it boils down to it, how high of a rank of a hunter you are is really all down to how far you awoke on the power scale. So if you want to be an S-rank hunter, then put your hands together and hope for a good awakening. And because of this, since Jinwoo awoke as an E-rank hunter, hunter, the prospects of him ever becoming a not E rank hunter were next to nothing, unless of course he underwent a second awakening, which are exceedingly rare. However, those who undergo a second awakening are able to surpass the rank that they awoke with in the first place. Now, does that second awakening always look like jinwoo's? No. A second awakening usually just looks like, oh, I was B rank, but now I'm A rank. It's a step up, it's an evolution, but not a perpetual evolution, because while jinwoo does undergo a second awakening, it's continual. However, that continuation only goes as far as he takes it. Jinwoo could have undergone his second awakening and then stayed an E rank hunter for the rest of his life, so long as he didn't collect enough experience to move up the certain amount of levels he needed to become a D rank, or a C rank, or a B rank, or a national rank. And now I know a lot of you are probably asking the question,
Okay, then what letter rank associates with what level?
if Jinwoo is level 50, is he a B rank hunter? We don't know. It's actually never told to us if there is an association between the numbers and the letters, because once again, Jinwoo is the only person with access to this RPG-like leveling system. However, we do always know Jinwoo's level, and we do know the level of the monsters that he defeats while at that level. And thus, it's kind of conventionally accepted that every 10 levels is a new letter. So levels 1 through 10 is E, 10 through 20 is D, and so on and so forth, until we get to A, S, and National, where levels 40 through 60 are accepted to be A, 60 through 80 are S, and then 100 to 120 is National. The only problem with this, though, is that the letter ranks for hunters is kind of logarithmic. That's to say, while there isn't a massive amount of difference between an E rank hunter and a D rank hunter, it's stated in the story that it would take 10 C rank hunters to kill a B rank hunter. But this also kind of makes sense, because we all know, if you've ever played an RPG, that leveling up in the early levels is super easy, but as you get higher and higher level, more experience is needed to get additional levels. So if power is an expression of how much experience you have, the difference between levels 59 and 60 is much larger than the difference between levels 1 and 2. However, because Jinwoo's second awakening now gives him access to make continual growth, he's able to stack all of the experiences that he has in every single dungeon and use that as a way to make his rank higher and higher and higher, giving him access to an almost limitless amount of power that propels him into the highest sphere of hunters and monsters on Earth. And as he gets stronger and stronger, the entire world begins to turn their eyes to him, until eventually the biggest monsters that Jinwoo has to worry about don't lie behind the doors of a dungeon. Unfortunately for you, you got a long way until you get there. And for that, that's basically everything that you need to know before starting solo leveling, which might end up being 2024's biggest and most important anime. But you guys tell me, are you excited for this manhwa to finally be adapted into anime form? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. You know you can tell the story is Korean when you consider the fact that the strongest person in the entire world is Chinese. Could never happen if it was Japan.